uno de mis mejores profesores, sin lugar a dudas, una persona que me enseñó a amar la salud pública y la salud internacional, profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, médico de la Universidad de Nueva York, magíster en salud pública de la Universidad de Johns Hopkins. Fue la persona que lideró las investigaciones del uso de sales de rehidratación oral. Recibió en el 2006 el premio Magidol, que es para la persona que haya mayores contribuciones en la salud pública. Este premio es como un Nobel a la salud pública. Posiblemente haya contribuido a salvar más vidas que la mayoría de los médicos en este planeta. Entonces espero que aprovechemos mucho lo que tiene que contarnos el día de hoy.
And reemerging diseases that so many of you have heard about. Zika, Ebola, chikungunya, dengue, and there are many others. So here's a case of smallpox, terrible disease. My early work I did in Bangladesh, so when I went there in 1967, 50 years ago, this was a common condition. 10 years later, it disappeared from the world. Eradication means gone from everywhere in the world. There are only two places that have this virus. One in the US, the CDC, and one in Russia. It shows that they don't trust each other too much. This is tetanus of the newborn, from cutting the cord with an unclean instrument, or the mother was not immunized. 80–90% mortality. You don't see it anymore. It's gone. Polio. Anybody seen the case of polio? But it's rare. Now, of course, in Latin America, no polio. There are only 3 countries in the world that have it: Nigeria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. This is measles, which has not been in Latin America for many, many years. And the numbers are coming down. But here you don't have it anymore. Diphtheria, you don't see. So there are many conditions that have actually disappeared, which is quite phenomenal. But we're going to focus now on new and re-emerging infectious diseases. Now, this is just a very small list. There may be 40 or more of these in the last 30 years, 35 years. And next to it, if an animal was involved in transmitting the virus, these are mostly viruses, to humans, I put that in brackets. So HIV/AIDS comes from the great apes, first seen in sub-Saharan Africa. SARS comes from bats who infected a certain kind of animal. And remember, the Chinese will eat everything. Everything on land except cars. Everything in the air except airplanes. And everything in the sea but boats. So they would kill the civet cat, and when you kill an animal, there's a spray of blood that you don't see. Just like when you bite into an apple, there's a spray. This was breathed in by the slaughterhouse workers. They got it, they spread it to others, and so on. Flu. H5N1, it's called avian flu, which had a very high mortality in people, but very few people were infected, only 500. And H1N1, and you notice I put ducks around that. All flu originates in ducks. It may get into pigs, which spread it to us. It may get into chickens that spread it to us, but it always begins with wild ducks. So in truth, all flu is avian flu. Nipah and Ebola, bats, probably. MERS, which is found in Saudi Arabia, bats and camels, dengue. Hepatitis C, which is caused by spread through injection. And lastly, I have MDR and XDR-TB, malaria, gonorrhea, cholera. Many diseases are now developing resistance to antibiotics, which is quite scary. Antibiotics were only discovered in the late 1930s. So it has only been 80 years that we've had antibiotics, and yet many conditions are become resistant to them. And I'll speak about that a little later. So I want to go over a few ideas, issues that we should think about. The first of these is, what is the source of these new infections? What factors lead to them emerging? Why do they go from one case to many cases? Because it always starts with one case. How does it become amplified? Why is there a variability in the epidemiology of this condition? What causes the same virus to behave differently in different situations? And here we will get into issues of behavior, anthropology, sociology, and so on, which we don't usually think of when we think of infectious diseases. And then how do we prepare for the future? Let's look at first at HIV. Now, HIV has been around for about 35, 40 years, although we can actually find the first cases appearing maybe in 1915 or something like that, maybe 100 years ago. But it didn't really come onto the scene until the late 1970s. But it spreads very differently in different parts of the world, very differently. This is now a disease primarily of Eastern and Southern Africa. Why does it behave differently? Well, let's take a look. Here's Africa from 1984 to 1999. And so you see here, in 1984, it was pretty much the same, hardly any in Southern Africa. But by 1999, the percentage of adults affected in Botswana, 40%. In the north, it still remains much less than in the south. Why? Why should this, we always talk about AIDS in Africa. Which Africa? Southern Africa? Northern Africa? Eastern Africa? West Africa? So when you talk about Africa, remember, there are lots of Africas. Okay? Well, why did this happen? Why is there this tremendous difference in the incidence and prevalence of disease? Well, some possible explanations. For example, we now know that if the male is circumcised, there is a much lower rate of infection. In the northern part of Africa, it's predominantly Muslim. Now, it's not that going to the mosque is going to protect you, or not eating pork is going to protect you, but they are circumcised. That's one protection. It reduces the infection in men by 70%. Secondly, there are far fewer partners. If we're talking about a disease that's sexually transmitted, clearly, the more partners you have, the greater your risk. The larger the number of partners you have with unprotected sex, the greater the risk. That makes sense. So number of partners. There's also, if you have multiple partners at the same time, concurrent, it's called concurrent sexual partners. So you have one partner on Monday, another one on Tuesday, another one on Wednesday, and another one on Thursday. Okay, that's 4. So over the course of a year, you may only have 4 partners, but if you have them sequentially like that, you run a far greater risk of amplifying the infection than if you have one partner for January, February, March, another one for April, May, June, and so on. Same number of partners, but concurrency increases your risk. So there are a number of other factors. The point is that here we have the same virus, spread the same way, but highly variable. What disease is this that I'm talking about? This is SARS. SARS transmission. Now here was a condition, fortunately for us, that was not highly infectious. It was related, as I said, to originally the killing of these civet cats. People got infected, they infected others, they infected others. So at the end of this epidemic, there were about 5,000, 6,000 people who were infected. Obviously, it didn't spread that quickly. Otherwise, since it started in China, there would have been millions infected. My wife and I were going to China at this time, and we delayed our trip there because I was afraid we would end up in some little godforsaken town that suddenly developed a SARS case, and we would be quarantined for 2 weeks in the middle of nowhere. So I said, let's wait until the epidemic is over, then we'll go visit China. But by the way, this is a travel tip. Always go to, if you're going to a country for a holiday, go to a place that's just had an epidemic. because everybody wants to sell you whatever they have, and you get really reduced prices. Because they haven't had any visitors in a long time. You come to the store and they say, oh, please take whatever we have. That's a travel tip, which has nothing to do with emergent infections. Influenza. This is something that we're justly afraid of. In the epidemic of 1918, called the Spanish flu. Now, everybody, of course, always wants to call the disease after somebody else. Okay, so the Spanish probably called it the English flu. The English call it the French flu. You know? So you always want to stigmatize somebody else. So nobody knows how many died. Somebody said 50 million, 100 million. It was huge. And this was a disease with a mortality of under 1%. The Asian flu, 1957, 1 to 4 million excess deaths. Hong Kong flu, and so on. When H5N1 came along, or what people called avian flu, people said, oh my God, what about this one? Because the mortality in people was around 40%. Can you imagine a flu with a mortality of 40%? It would make the Spanish flu seem like, well, a pebble in the ocean. Fortunately, this virus does not spread well to people. It kills lots of chickens and very few people. Now, what should you do about this? Well, one strategy was, let's cull or kill all the chickens where we find one case. So if one of these chickens comes down with H5N1, and by the way, there are many things that kill chickens, we cull them, we kill all of them. We get rid of them. And I'll show you how this was also done with Nipah in Malaysia. Now, it's one thing to do that where you're growing chickens like this. Where somebody is growing thousands and thousands of chickens. But in India, Bangladesh, maybe even in rural Colombia, they're grown in the villages. Somebody has 10 chickens, 20 chickens. So if you develop a strategy that says, once you have a chicken that dies, you come and tell us, the government, we'll come and cull your flock, and then we'll pay you for the chickens that we've killed. Well, that sounds reasonable, right? But what if your whole income is based on 10 chickens or 20 chickens? So in India, for example, they had somebody come in from the government. I said, look, I got a chicken that died. They sent somebody in with a white suit. Now, can you imagine being a villager and having somebody come in and look like a space cadet, right? And of course, then that person kills them and throws them in a pit. Now, you notice that nobody in the village is wearing one of those white suits. So people must be saying, well, what's going on here? And then the government comes along and says, here's some money for the chickens. How much money do you think they give them? They give them 100% of the value of the chicken? If they get 10%, they're lucky. So within a very short period of time, the villager says, excuse me, I'm not going to go tell the government, because they're going to kill my chickens, give me 10% of what they're worth. So what do people do? What do people do when they have a sick chicken or a sick cow? They may hide it, they may take it to another market and sell it, or they kill it before it dies. Most cultures do not allow you to eat dead meat. That is, carrion. Something that, if your chicken is running around and something drops dead, you can't eat that chicken. But if that chicken is going around and you grab it and kill it, you can put it in the pot. So you eat it before it dies. Same thing is true with cows that may have anthrax, and so on. So this is, I can't tell you what happens here in Colombia, but this is what happens in South Asia. So, these strategies that are developed at WHO in Geneva, or the CDC, about killing all the chickens in your chicken farm, don't work in these situations. You have to adapt to what's going on in this particular environment. The pig has an immune system somewhat similar to ours. It can go directly from the duck to us or through some mixing bowl. And then it starts to spread between us. Okay? So let's look at what took place and how rapidly this spread. This is the H1N1 outbreak of 2009 that supposedly began in Mexico and was mislabeled swine flu. I think it's a bad practice to name any virus after either an animal or a place. You think people want to be, you think Bogotá would be thrilled to be the home of the Bogotá virus? I don't think so. So here it is, April. This is June. It doesn't take long for these viruses to spread globally. Okay? Very quickly. And almost impossible to stop. Now, if H1N1 had the same mortality as H5N1, I would say half of this room wouldn't be here, because that's how high the mortality would be. Well, in Egypt they decided, well, somebody called this the swine flu, let's get rid of all of the pigs. The pigs, in fact, were raised by the Coptic Christians. The majority of people in Egypt are Muslim. Muslims don't like pork too much. So this was not only a misguided strategy to get rid of the virus, it was also politically and ethnically part of that. Politics and ethnicity and religion also became part of the strategy. Of course, they found out that once they killed all the pigs, they lost their garbage collection system. Because then they didn't have enough goats to eat all the garbage, which is what the pigs used to do. So the pig raisers would take their pigs out to the garbage dumps. Pigs would eat that. They'd go back, kill the pigs, sell the pork to those people who were pork eaters. We'll come to that again. I'm going to talk a little bit about bats and the spread of new and emerging diseases. This is a fruit bat, and they eat fruit. They have a wingspan about like this. So in the evening time, when the bats go out to hunt for insects or to go to fruit trees and so on, you'll see them flapping across. I don't know whether you have them here in Colombia, they're all over the world. Vast, huge bats, which of course are no danger unless somehow they carry a virus that can infect us. Now, why bats? Why are bats so much involved in this? That's a whole other issue. But let me tell you just one story. This is a story of a disease called Nipah virus, named after a town in Malaysia called Nipah. And what was happening is that there was a number of workers, about 250 workers, who were in the abattoirs, the slaughterhouses for pigs. Now Malaysia is about 70% Muslim and 30% Chinese. Chinese are, of course, pork eaters. And Malaysia was a major exporter of pork to Singapore, to China, and elsewhere. They couldn't figure out where was this, and finally they put the story together. Then what was happening was that these fruit bats were feeding on the fruit of trees that had been placed in the farms where the pigs were being raised to protect them against the sun. Pigs don't sweat very well, which is why they wallow in the water. These, clearly, the urine or the feces of the bats carry this virus. This virus, then, the fruit then dropped down, the pigs ate the fruit. In eating the fruit, they created this aerosol spray. They developed a pneumonia. So the virus now becomes amplified. They then are taken to the slaughterhouse, and the pigs cough in the face of the workers. The workers develop the pneumonia, and die. This is a highly lethal virus. 40% mortality, 50% mortality. Okay? So from a few bats coming down, affecting some pigs, and by the way, what happens when you have sick pigs? You start taking it to other markets, right? So we become the spreader of the condition. The pigs are spreading it amongst themselves, then we take the sick pigs to other markets, and those pigs start to infect other pigs. And pretty soon you've gone from one to many. And how did they get rid of it? Well, they got rid of it by killing all the pigs. Couldn't kill the bats, obviously. But they killed the pigs. Now, it's one thing to kill a lot of chickens, about this big. Killing a lot of pigs is a lot. Now, today, Malaysia, which once had a very vigorous export business, there are no more pig farms in Malaysia. Wipe them out. Okay? This is the Ebola virus. This is the Ebola virus. Another flavivirus. It's a flavivirus. Now, this is just to point out to you that Ebola was in Africa back in 1976 for the first cases. I remember because I had a project in the southern Sudan. And we were screened when we got to London. They didn't know it was Ebola, but the first early cases came from right here. And I remember going back to London, and they said there's this new thing that's killing people. We don't know what it is. Do you have a fever? You know, that's the only thing they ever ask you at the airport. Do you have a fever, right? Do you have a fever? Well, no, I don't have a fever because I just took some aspirin before I came to see you. That's why I don't have a fever. But you see, it was, whoops, I knew that was right. So, you see, it was in Central Africa, primarily Uganda, southern Sudan, and so on. And then suddenly it appears in West Africa. Now, the West Africans are not used to this. They've never seen anything like this before. Okay? And it starts to kill people. Forget all these numbers on the side, except to say that the outbreak in West Africa had as many cases and many more deaths than all of the other outbreaks combined. Why? Why did that happen? Why should this outbreak in Western Africa, which then caused the whole world to get, I'm sure that some of you had things in your hospital. What to do if an Ebola patient shows up? How should we deal with it? What's the chance of it spreading? And so on and so on. About 11,000 people died. People who were treating patients who had what they thought was Ebola were wearing all these kind of fancy suits. And you can't wear these suits for more than about 40 minutes because it's so hot inside and so on. These are very difficult. Okay, these are people who were collecting bodies, working in hospitals and so on. This was one of our graduates actually from a number of years ago in Liberia who was trying to educate villagers about this disease. Because a lot of the education that was coming forward was not always appropriate. For example, people were told, don't bury or don't have a death ceremony for your loved one who may die. But the culture was very much about performing your duty to somebody in your family who has died. That your duty as a survivor was to help escort the person to the next world. Now somebody comes along and says, you can't do that anymore. You give the body to us, we'll put it in the ground. I said, but this is my mother, this is my father. He said, we don't care. That's the way the epidemic has to be contained. So what do people do? Well, many of them did what they did with the chickens. They just don't tell you. Because if you're going to prevent me from doing my duty, my sacred duty, I'm just not going to let you know. So this became an issue. So there were differences. In Central Africa, most of the epidemics burned out after a few hundred cases. West Africa, that didn't happen. Why? Well, first of all, it was much quicker to go from rural to urban. Many of these other outbreaks, the rural communities were quite isolated. So the epidemic would come into the village, burn itself out, and that was the end of it. Here you had roads connecting rural to urban. So it got into Monrovia and other large cities in West Africa. We always thought that this was a hemorrhagic disease. That is, people would bleed from their nose, from their eyes, from their gut. But it appeared differently here. There was some hemorrhaging, but lots of these people had diarrheal disease. Why was there this difference? We don't know. But one thing we can do with this now is we can follow these patients. And it turns out that many of them carry the virus even if they survive. Mortality here is 50%, 60%. We found the virus in the eye. We have found the virus in the spinal fluid. So some of these conditions don't disappear when you get better. In fact, you can still carry the virus, which has all sorts of public health implications. Past behavior may not affect future events. In other words, we see Zika in northeast Brazil. Does it behave the same way in Colombia? Actually, Colombia has had very, very few cases of microcephaly. Now, whether they will have cases of other neurologic complications, we don't know yet. We won't know for 3 or 4 years how many of these children born of women who have been infected with Zika will carry with them other complications. But why is there this great difference? Well, Colombia, it's much, first of all, many of these cases in Brazil began in the northeast, in very poor areas, in areas where there was political and religious conservative. In Colombia, abortion is much easier to come by. You found out about the epidemic after Brazil found out about theirs. There are lots of differences here. The characteristics of the population, the age structure, population density. Is the mosquito present? Well, Bogotá doesn't have to worry about this. So it's in certain areas of the country that are more susceptible. Past social and immunologic experience. We still don't know the relationship between the Zika virus and dengue, for example. Still being worked out. Chikungunya. The level of medical and public health infrastructure. How good is it? Is it better here in Colombia? Do you have greater access to public health interventions, to diagnostic interventions? Okay, so here's the same virus, spread by the same mosquito, but appearing very differently in 2 parts of Latin America, where the viruses come within 6 months to a year. And then cultural practices. What are they? And how do they differ from one place to another? You're familiar with this lady, this female Aedes aegypti. You can tell from the white banding on her legs. And of course, she's the one who's getting the blood meal. And of course, the great tragedy of Zika. A horrible tragedy. It's a tragedy that I don't think any of us can fully appreciate. This is not a one-off situation. This is what these families must face for the rest of their life. Okay? And that's the most severe form of it. Again, we don't know all the learning difficulties and disabilities that might occur when these cases eventually get into 5, 6, 7-year-old. This is simply to point out that most of the new and emerging diseases that we will see in the world today are zoonotic diseases. That is, they are spreading from animals to man, from animals to humans, pigs, ducks, chickens, apes, and it's related to our interaction with these and the effectiveness of these viruses in adapting to our immune system. H5N1 did not, H1N1 did. These are extremely expensive. It is not simply a matter of morbidity and mortality in humans. In Bangladesh, Nipah has led to maybe 250 deaths. In Malaysia, about 250 deaths. Plus, Malaysia killed their whole pork industry, $540 million. BSE, bovine spongiform encephalitis, or mad cow disease, had a devastating impact on the cattle industry in Great Britain. By the way, this was caused probably by feeding cows parts of sheep. That is, they turned the poor cows into carnivores, and the sheep, which carried something called scrapie, or a prion-related disease, infected the cattle. H5N1, H1N1, who knows? Billions of dollars lost in trade, in tourism, in healthcare. So the cost of the health system may be only a fraction of the total cost of any of these conditions. And there are other examples of that. Zika, I haven't put down. This is H1N1 in Mexico during the tourist season in Acapulco. Nobody goes. Because tourists today can say, well, yeah, cancel my reservation. I'm not going to go to Mexico, I'm going to go to Trinidad, or whatever the hell it is. Okay? So, hotels, tourist things, the economy, clearly, those ventures should be filled with people, but they're not. And Mexico lost a huge amount of money in tourism at that time. Now, what factors actually lead to the spread of these conditions? Why are we entering a time in life a time in human history when these things are going to be a scourge forever on us, or are they? We need to understand where they're coming from. Now, it's not that zoonoses are new. Measles is related to a disease in cattle called rinderpest, and probably did not appear in human populations until about 1,000 years ago. And yet has led to, of course, millions and millions of deaths. One, we have increased population density. So more of us are crowded into smaller spaces. Well, obviously, like those chickens I showed you, it's easier to spread that way. We have, in many parts of the world, inadequate infrastructure for water and sanitation. Now, I'm sure Colombia is far better off than India and Bangladesh, which is where I do a lot of my work. But where you have inadequate water and sanitation, you again increase the risk of spread. India has the largest amount of open defecation in the world. Okay? Open defecation leads to contamination of water supplies, and so on and so on. People travel now. both voluntarily and involuntarily, through tourism and through internal migration, either purposefully or they're pushed off their land. This has certainly been an issue here in Colombia. And it's an issue in many parts, Syria, so on and so on. This leads to a vast movement of people. Okay. Centralized food production. When you go to the market today, you don't know where your things are coming from. It doesn't say, this is from Richard Cash's farm in Bogotá. You have no idea. You're having a much more efficient production of food, but if food gets contaminated at a central source, it can spread much easier, as we know. Antibiotic and drug misuse. I'll say a few words about this when I talk about TB. We may overuse drugs. We may underuse treatment, that is, we treat for 1 day rather than 5 days. People may not comply. They say, here, take this. And if you go home, every one of you go home and you look in your medicine cabinet, you will see bottles that say for 5 days, 3 days, 2 days, with medicine still in them. Right? We all go through that. Everybody. Counterfeit drugs. People are producing, there's now a great fear that with malaria, we're misusing artemisinin, the last best drug we have for malaria. Why? Because it's being counterfeited in areas of Cambodia. So people are not getting what they're supposed to get. Instead of getting 100 milligrams, they're only getting 10 milligrams, or nothing. Now you say, well, that's Cambodia. No, it's not Cambodia. It's Cambodia and Africa and Latin America and anywhere where these drugs are sold. We truly are a global community. And lastly, we have dysfunctional health systems. People say, well, why should we invest in the public health system? We don't have smallpox anymore. There's no more tetanus. There's no more diphtheria. There's no more polio. Why invest in public health? Well, because all of the things that you don't have is because the public health system gave that to you. But there's a tendency for people to say, well, I want the best hospital, the best treatment, the best drugs. Well, if you have a good public health system, you can obviate the need for many of these interventions. So, this is again Dhaka, where I do so much of my work. This is a very nice area, and here's the slum, right across the river. Okay. How many times have we seen pictures like this? And of course, the people in the slum areas don't have good water, good sanitation, and so they're defecating right in the area that surrounds the fanciest part of town. As if somehow the viruses or the bacteria say, oh, we better not cross that line. That's where the wealthy people live. Okay? We'll just stay on our side. Okay? So why should we care so much about these stage 3 zoonoses? Because if they develop the competency to spread between people, then we have a problem. Measles, as I said, rinderpest in cattle, HIV from apes, influenza from ducks, chickens, pigs, Ebola, Nipah from bats. And just to remind you again of how interconnected we are, these are the global air routes. So you can see, I suppose, if you live in the middle of the Sahara Desert, you're reasonably okay. But there's a problem with that. But otherwise, you can see the tremendous amount of interconnectedness of these are just the global air routes. One strategy that some have looked upon as a possible way of reducing the impact of zoonoses is through a strategy called One Health. Do any of you know about this? This is an attempt to link veterinary health to human health. That is, we are all interconnected, not just as people, but as people and all of that surrounds us. So let's take an example. This would be the wild animals. These are vectors. These illnesses, such as HIV, can spill over either into domestic animal, where it gets amplified, as with MERS, or directly into people, where it gets amplified. In other words, for any of these epidemics to go forward, we have to go from one to many. Now, the strategy is that if we can develop, better surveillance, so we can pick these things up earlier, and therefore develop strategies that says, hey, this could come along, let's have a better strategy. Remember, Zika was discovered in 1948. It's a new virus. It was picked up many, many years ago. Why it's been in hiding all of this time, we really don't know. We just know that there was an outbreak in Polynesia, and Guillain-Barré syndrome was associated, and then it moved here. So we don't really know. But the notion is, if we can follow some of these, or we can get some idea, maybe we can prevent some of these, and therefore the amplification that would normally take place here would be greatly reduced. That's the notion. That's the strategy. That's the idea. Is it so? Well, we really haven't put it to the test that much. But it's calling for greater surveillance, greater attention to what is happening in the animal world as a predictor or a possible predictor of what could happen with humans. One Health is the attempt to look at that. And the benefits then, of course, would be in reducing this large number of cases to fewer. This requires surveillance. It requires looking to see what is going on in the animal kingdom. And by the way, there are illnesses that can go from humans to animals. It doesn't just go one way, it can go the other way. Just a few words about tuberculosis, a terrible disease.
Dr. Cash.
Yes.
Could you give us an example of this strategy, One Health, put into action?
Okay, let's go back. Let's go back to that. One could argue that doing surveillance in wet markets, wet market is where you actually slaughter the animal. This has been done in China, where they've picked up a number of viruses early on among chickens who have died, and they have then closed some of those markets, or they have pushed quicker for a vaccine. We are able, frankly, because of our technology now, to produce vaccines at a far more rapid pace than we were able to. Now, so that's one example that I can think of. Are you familiar with the term, the canary in the mine? Canary is a little yellow bird. And when the coal miners would go into the mine, they would take these little canaries with them. Because the canary was very susceptible to carbon monoxide. Now, carbon monoxide has no smell. It has no taste. These are put into the natural gas that we use, so we can detect it. The carbon monoxide you cannot detect. So when the little canary would go, people say, "Let's get the hell out of here," because there's carbon monoxide. Now, is it possible to pick up certain conditions in the animal population that would trigger us to be more responsive? Now, you raise a good point, because what do we look for? Do we look for everything? There's some things, if we had seen a lot of chickens dying off from H5N1 early on, well, we still have to see whether it jumps to humans. That's our protection. That's our firewall. Does the virus go from the animal, from the duck, to the chicken, to us? If it doesn't come to us, then what are we supposed to do? Do we produce a vaccine in anticipation? Do we kill all the chickens in anticipation? We haven't worked out all the details yet. But the theory is that as we are all part of the same island, we can't totally look at veterinary medicine as something. Veterinarians are interested in these diseases because they kill their animals, which have an economic consequence. The humans aren't looking at the economics, but they're also looking at what is it going to do to us. If we had known about simian immune deficiency virus, which then becomes HIV, could we have initiated some strategies? Could we have thought of things ahead? I don't know. But the question you ask is the major question. So just a few words about tuberculosis, because it is such a common condition and has become more of an issue with HIV, because HIV makes you more susceptible to tuberculosis. This is the acid-fast bacteria that causes TB. Now, there's no doubt that treatment is extremely effective. There's been a 47, almost a 50% decline in mortality since 1990, when the global programs began. It's estimated 43 million lives may have been saved. Treatment of a person is also effective in reducing spread, because if you have pulmonary TB and you're coughing, you can affect those around you. However, there is something called MDR TB, multiple drug-resistant TB. Okay? The problem with all of these resistant organisms is the next level of treatment may be 100 times what the treatment is for regular tuberculosis. Drug resistance emerged with each new drug used, because it wasn't used always effectively. Less drug resistance was observed when drugs were used in combination, as they're doing now for malaria and so on. But you have to use them properly. Resistant strains come from patients who retain their ability to transmit the condition.